little bit of the story behind part of the story behind how I got started working on the work that ended up becoming resilient agriculture, cultivating food systems for a changing climate, and then just show you some of the big ideas. And I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on some of those ideas. Does that sound like a plan, Liz? Okay, great. So I'm going to share my screen, and what I intend to do is come off of a screen share and maybe go back on. It's really up to you how you'd like to engage or discuss these ideas. So let me do that. And we can get started. So first, just a little bit about me. I have been working in soil health and sustainable cropping systems for lots of years, more than 30, which is kind of a surprise to be able to say, but here I am, and it's been a really fabulous 30 years of being involved with both farmers, working in education, working in research. I've been an activist, a food system activist, and also been a farmer myself. So it's been quite a rich and interesting career, thinking with others and working together in community to understand what it takes to make a sustainable food system. So I bring all of that experience to this work. And I'll tell you a little bit more about how I specifically got into climate change adaptation in just a few minutes. I also wanted to let you know what I'm doing these days. I've been based in Asheville, North Carolina for about 20 years, but I just recently accepted the position of Director of Agriculture at the Glenwood Center for Regional Food and Farming. And we're based in the Hudson Valley of New York. And so I wanted to share just a little bit about the work of Glenwood, and how and what our strategies are for achieving the just transformation of the U.S. food system. So Glenwood's been working on this transformation for about 25 years or so through 4 different complementary strategies. And the first is training farmers in sustainable, regenerative, organic practices, whatever your label, your favorite label is. But they're basically, it's how to grow food and be smart business people, using ecological and socially just or equitable practices. So that's that's the farmer training program. We also work to empower change makers throughout the food system. So everything from seed producers all the way through to the eaters, the folks that are eating the food grown by those farmers. And so we work throughout the food system to understand what the needs are of that particular community working within the different parts of the food system, and then working to provide the support they need to make this change to a just food system. And the third strategy is we're very good at creating coalitions. So as in part or hand in hand with this empowering changemaker work, we also work to develop networks, to strengthen networks, and to support networks to create the change that we're working for at Glenwood. And then finally, we have quite a robust food access program and food sovereignty program, local food for every table, where we're working to be sure that local food is a right and not a privilege. So a little bit about me and resilient agriculture. Resilient Agriculture, the first edition was published in 2015, and about a decade before that, I got really interested in looking at this question of what climate change means for farmers. And it was just sort of one thing led to another. And before I knew it, I was invited into being a lead author on the USDA's first report on how we were going to adapt US agriculture to climate change. And all along through this work, after doing that report, I was the lead on the adaptation chapter, and I was very surprised to learn at that time, which was around 2011 or so, that there was really very little information available about how US farmers were being impacted by changing weather patterns associated with climate change, and then what they could do about it. So after finishing that report, I began what has turned into more than a decade of doing case study work with leading farmers and ranchers all over the US to understand how changing weather patterns are affecting their ability to grow food, how they're adapting, and also what turned out to be one of the most important questions, how they think about cultivating resilience on their own farms and ranches. So what does climate change mean for farmers? I thought the National Farmers Union put it very simply, but very profoundly in these three simple bullets. And so I'll just go through these. The first is that it's going to get more difficult and expensive to grow food. The second is that climate stressors, so these are both the direct weather impacts, weather pattern change impacts, heavier rains, more drought periods, more and more flooding, for example. So it's those direct weather impacts, but also the indirect impacts, which I think of as the more subtle climate change effects, and which actually have a lot of important effects in farming and food systems and in communities. So climate stressors, both directly related to weather pattern changes, but also all those knock-on effects. For example, increasing pest populations, or populations can overwinter, and therefore you have earlier and higher pest populations in spring and then moving into fall. So both the direct effects and also those knock-on effects will strain relationships between farmers and communities. And so that, I think of those first two statements as sort of the dark side of climate change and agriculture, or climate change in the food system. But there's also a light side, and there's been a lot of coverage and public conversation about this in the last, I'd say 5 or 6 years. And that is that agricultural landscapes can also be a source of climate change solutions. And it was in this work with the USDA, developing the USDA report, and then more deeply as I got into the case study research and then began to write Resilient Agriculture, that I really had a chance to dig into this idea of resilience and the kind of resilience that, it turns out there are several different, there are in at least 4 or 5 different disciplines that have separately and in parallel developed ideas in resilient science over the last 50 years or so. And the type of resilient science that it made sense to me was most applicable to farm management and the food system was a type called social ecological resilience. And this kind of resilience is looking at what are the characteristics, behaviors, qualities of ecosystems that are dominated by humans or dominated by human management. And that certainly, to me, describes a farm or farming systems. So all the references that I make to resilience today in this session are grounded in social ecological resilience science. So I just want to give you a sense of where the farms that are included in resilient agriculture are located. So as I said, this project, I started it in 2011 or so, and it has really just grown beyond anything I ever imagined. It's now about a decade old, and will continue into the future, and involves at this point 45 different ecologically based farms all around the country. And they're distinguished, this group of farms is distinguished from all farming in the US because, first of all, they are using ecological practices. Some of these farmers consider themselves sustainable, others ecological, others regenerative. We have some farmers that are thinking of what they do now as climate smart farming or carbon farming. Am I missing any? Oh, there's a few biodynamic farmers in this group. But so that is one quality of these farms that distinguish them from all US agriculture. A second important one is they are growing food. So they're growing whole, nutrient-dense foods to sell into local and regional markets. Directly or through direct wholesale to consumers. And then the third important quality of this group of farmers is that they have all, in one way or another, been recognized either nationally or regionally as being particularly good farmers. So I know I have a special group of farmers that I've been working with, and they've taught me a lot over the last decade of talking with them, visiting their farms, and checking in with them every now and again to see how things are going. And you can learn more about these farmers, read some of their stories, and also each story is linked. There are other stories about these farmers, their websites, and other information about them. And you can find them all at this Real World Resilience Stories of Land, People, and Community page. A lot of the stories out of the first edition of Resilient Agriculture are available here as a free download, and I encourage you to visit that page and to get to know some of these farmers just a little bit. So I wonder, before we get going, any questions at the moment or any comments anyone would like to make? So Liz, I'm counting on you to be watching the chat because I can't see it. Okay, it looks like perhaps there are none. Hearing none, I will move right on. So Resilient Agriculture, the second edition, opens with what to me is a very powerful expression of our call to action in these times. It's a poem by the farmer poet Digger. It's called Dandelion. There is a lot to learn in this moment from those who some call weeds, like the settler who names another invader, and the dandelion, who with the utmost humility quietly defies the hubris of the plowman, repairing with taproots the hardened ground and sharing in abundance their nectar, their pollen, and their seeds with the world. Pay attention to them, young blood, and how they not only survive, but thrive through moments of change. The overall structure of resilient agriculture follows this framework of thinking that comes out of climate change adaptation science. And it's basically lays out and breaks up this idea of vulnerability. First of all, if you look at the bottom of the figure, first of all, into these two kinds of buckets of ideas called adaptive capacity and potential impact. And if we follow potential impact up, what we see is that there's exposure is one part of potential impact, and that's very simply the weather events experienced at any particular place. And the other is sensitivity. And very simply, that is the response or potential for damage in a specific place, in a specific system to those specific weather events. So that's the potential impact part of vulnerability, exposure and sensitivity. And then where the story gets a lot richer, at least for me, is this other side of vulnerability, which is adaptive capacity. And that's the capacity to make changes or to design and manage systems that are able to avoid damage when there is some kind of disturbance or shock, or if damage occurs, they're able to recover quickly and at low cost. So this idea of adaptive capacity is you can break up into these three different variables that all go into determining a particular adaptive capacity of a system. And that's operating context, which is all the resources plus regulations as kind of social and ecological context for the operation of that system. In this case, we're thinking about farming systems. Also, the knowledge and options available to the managers and workers in that system, and then also individual capability to make good decisions, to act on information, and also to look into the future and make some choices about how to prepare. So this is a very common vulnerability framework for coming out of climate change adaptation science. And I laid the book out, very naturally laid the book out in these kinds of, with this sort of a framework. So the book opens with exposure. And one of the things that I think is really important when we're thinking about climate change, adaptation, and the effects of climate change, and what it's going to take for agriculture and food systems to adapt to climate change. Taking a step back and looking at overall human climate history is a very important part of this story. I'm not going to walk through all of this. You're looking at it while I'm speaking to you, but also the really important part to me about this graph is that if you take a look at the very end, where beginning of agriculture shows up and great European civilizations show up, what you see is it turns out that if you look over all of climate history, pretty much most everything we think of as civilization has emerged during what turns out to be a very unusual period of climate stability. You see how the squiggles get very small there towards the end of this graph. And what climate change is doing is pushing us out of this, or pushing the Earth out of this period of climatic stability. And so when we talk about farmers these days having this new challenge, never before experienced challenge, it's really a lot bigger than that, because it turns out that farmers over the last century haven't had to deal with this challenge. But it's even more than that. No farmer anywhere at any time during the history of agriculture has ever had this kind of weather challenge to deal with. This is sobering, but I think it's also, it helps us all think about why it is that farmers and others in the food system really do need support to be able to achieve the transition to a more climate resilient agriculture. I then go on to, I worked with climate scientists, both at the national level and at regional levels, to develop this set of tables, which do not appear, I believe, in any other book. And it lays out in a very straightforward form the kinds of changes that we've already observed in the weather, and then a summary of expected changes to a number of different kinds of weather events through mid-century. And so you see, I'm showing you here the table from the Midwest, but they're actually tables for 7 other regions within the US. And as I've worked with, once I developed this information in this way, and I've worked with lots of farmers and also technical advice folks over the last 6 or 7 years around this question of how do we prepare, how do we improve farm resilience, how do we reduce climate risk. And what I understand from work with farmers is this kind of a layout in terms of just helping them think about how things have, weather has changed, how it's likely to change in the next 20 years or so, is very helpful.
Laura, there was a quick question in the chat.
Okay.
It was from Sandra, and she may need to elaborate, but how do you fine-tune this concept of the unique problems of climate change, given the fact that this is a human-created problem? Or maybe that part is coming later.
How to define it as a human-created problem? That's a great question. I guess I don't see any conflict between describing it as unique and describing it as a human. Maybe if you could, I think we're small enough, unless there's been a lot of folks. No, we've only got 25 or so. If you want to unmic and let's talk about that a little bit. It's an interesting question. And I'll take us off share too.
Okay. I'm just wondering if there are unique opportunities for turning our problems around, given the fact that we made them in the first place.
Ah, okay, yes. Well, I guess the short answer to that is yes, because we've evolved this way of feeding ourselves, or at least this is the way I think about answering your question. We have evolved a certain way of feeding ourselves, and obviously there are other parts of the way we've designed our communities that contribute to climate change. But certainly the way that we have evolved to feed ourselves is contributing in significant ways to climate change. And so we can choose to change the way we're feeding ourselves. And that is a very uniquely human problem. Is that, or it's uniquely human behavior. And so we can decide to change our behavior as one part of the solution to climate change. Am I getting at what you were thinking about, Sandra?
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the question.
I just want to add to that, Laura, if you don't mind. And that is, I think it's, yes, you know, that humans, especially farmers at the local level, right, like can change the practices on their farms. However, there is so many, you know, very powerful interests that are, you know, entrenched in this system and have, you know, are massively profiting from the way that it is. So we can't, it's sort of yes, and we also need to continue to organize, to build power, to hold those, you know, decision makers accountable, to transform the agricultural system that we need to do.
Yes. And I believe I very carefully chose my words. If I didn't, I apologize, but I did not say farmers need to change. I said we need to change. And so that's pretty subtle, I suppose, but I don't at all see this as the farmers need to solve this problem for us. In fact, I think that is one criticism I have of the regenerative agriculture movement is there's so much focus on if we can just get these farmers to change what they're doing, we'll solve the problem. It is, whenever I hear that argument, I always think about, I heard this idea from Julia Butterfly, and I don't know, I think a lot of people have forgotten who she is, but she lived in a tree. She was a huge influence on me. Her activism and resistance was huge influence on me. She lived in a tree for, I can't remember exactly now, 2 or 3 years to keep it from being cut down. She was in the Pacific Northwest. And I had the privilege of seeing her in person once and listened to her speak. And one of the things she said was, it's always stuck with me. This is 20 or 30 years now, it's stuck with me, which is whenever you point a finger at someone else, remember there are 3 pointing back at you. And I think particularly in this day and age when there is so much conflict and so much blame being thrown around, that is just an important idea, I think, for us all to keep in mind, because there is no one solution to climate change. It's going to, I believe it's going to take all of us in many different ways, changing the way that we live and changing the way our communities are organized. It's really going to take all of us. So thanks for that too, Liz. Okay. The last chance before I head back to the PowerPoint. If anybody wants to ask another question. Okay, let's see. Oh, I did that wrong. Okay, we'll move through. Whoa. Okay, so I've laid out kind of that first section where we talked about the book lays out what exposures are. I didn't go into it too much here, but there's also quite a bit written about sensitivities in food and farming systems to these changes in weather patterns. And then I move into the solution or a solution, or the way I think about it is social ecological resilience gives us a framework, a set of language and concepts that can help us think through together in community solutions for effective solutions for climate change within the food system. And actually, although my work is focused mostly on food and farming, these ideas are widely applicable to any kind of system that is dominated by human design and management. So the second part of the book leans into or gets into a discussion of what social ecological resilience science is, and some of the language and tools that are in social ecological resilience science that are particularly applicable to farm and food systems. And so I just want to now, we're going to quickly go through just a few of these ideas or concepts or tools that I have found particularly useful in my own work. And here's the first one. Most of us, when we think about resilience, I think this is still true, or most people, I think this is still true, think about resilience as bouncing back. And if you don't remember anything else from this session today, I want you to remember this. Resilience is about a whole lot more than bouncing back. And in fact, it's the other capacities of resilience that are going to be more useful to us as we begin to transform the food system. So what are those capacities? Well, that capacity in the middle, that recovery capacity, that is the bounce back capacity that many of us think about when we think of resilience. But response capacity is incredibly powerful. I think we got somebody unmuted. If you could please mute. Thanks. Response capacity is actually much more valuable than the capacity to bounce back or the ability to bounce back. Response capacity speaks to the ability to design and manage systems like a farm or a food system to be able to avoid damage when there's a disturbance or a shock. So how great is that? You don't have to ever bounce back because you've managed it, you've designed and manage it to be able to avoid damage from a disturbance. And so that's response capacity. And we actually know a lot. There's a deep wisdom available to farmers to think about how to rethink design and management of their systems. And this deep wisdom stretches all the way back to indigenous knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge, and we can draw on all of that in order to rethink our farming systems. Particularly in farming, because that is the part of the food system that is most directly or most deeply rooted in land, so in the ecology of a place. So that's response capacity. Recovery capacity, it's still important to cultivate recovery capacity in the event that a disturbance or shock overwhelms the response capacity of the system. And then there's another capacity that gets probably the least attention in conversations around resilience, and that's transformation capacity. And very simply put, transformation capacity is the ability of that system. Now remember, we're talking about human-dominated systems, so there are people in these systems as well. But the ability of that system to step back and realize that things are not going well, and that there's a need for a change in order to prepare. We got another mic off. If you please, everybody, check and make sure your mics are muted. Thanks. So this is that third part of resilience, the ability to recognize when things aren't going as planned, or the performance of your system is declining over time, and it's time to make some big changes. I think about this capacity as the bounce forward. And every time a system, be it a farm business or a food system or just a community of any kind, every time they sustain damage from a disturbance or shock, could be weather related, could be other kinds of disturbances or shocks. Every time there is damage, you have the choice of bouncing back, building back to some 20th century standard, or we can choose to bounce forward to some new standard that is that's informed by everything we've learned over the last 200 years about how the planet works, about what it means to have equitable social systems, and so on. And so I'm very excited about this bounce forward part of resilience. And a lot of my work now is situated more in thinking about that. Absolutely working to design systems that have high response capacity, so there's less damage. But then when there is damage, really understanding what it means to bounce forward and how we can do that well. So another idea that I explore in this part of the resilience part of the book is really trying to help myself and everyone else understand what is the difference between what I call in the book an industrial thinking, how resilient thinking is different from that, and even how resilient thinking is really different from sustainability thinking. And so I have a lot of discussion of it. I bring in lots of different voices into this part of the book. Um, but very simply put, this graphic from the book kind of lays out my basic argument. And that is that industrial thinking, or kind of, you can think of it as conventional agriculture and food systems, or global agriculture and food systems, the way we eat now, is different from resilient agriculture, resilient food system in this way. Industrial food systems tend to focus on recovery from disturbances and shocks, and they focus on that through financial and built or technological assets or resources. And they tend to, these kinds of systems put less emphasis on cultivating natural, human, and social resources. A resilient system, in contrast, would focus really on cultivating high quality resources across all these 5 different assets. And then in my own thinking, because one of the challenges for me in this work was to understand the difference between sustainability and resilience. And so one of the things I think is true about sustainable agriculture is that there has been, so that history of sustainable agriculture, the development of the idea over the last 50 years or so, is that there's more focus compared to industrial agriculture on cultivating natural, human, and social assets or resources, and relatively less on financial, or less dependence in sustainable systems on financial and built or technological resources. So interesting thoughts, and this is very broad brush, and I'm also open to disagreement or challenge to any of these ideas. But I thought it was important, or at least it was important in my understanding of resilience, to take the time to understand and kind of tease out how these 3 different ways of thinking are working within our food system and within ideas about what makes a good food system, or particularly for me, my work has leaned into a just food system. So another idea that I found very useful in thinking about the just transition
Laura?
is, yes?
I'm sorry to interrupt. There was
Okay.
another question in the chat from Carmen. Do you feel that the way urban and small farms will be a solution to climate change?
Do I feel that small and urban farms will be a solution?
Yes.
Is that what it is? I think, yes, I think they will be part of a solution. And what I know from my work is that the right size, or the resilient size, for a just food system is a regional food system. And within that regional food system, you will have hyper-local, local, kind of inter-regional, I mean, sorry, not inter, so hyper-local, local, and regional food systems. And so all those parts will be important. And that's got to do with response capacity. Well, it's got to do with the reality that resilience requires regional innovation and the ability to adjust across these different scales of food systems. So I'll dig into that in just a little more. I'll give you an example from the book about that in just a minute. But yes, simple answer, yes. Local and or urban food systems are all going to play an important role. Let's see what's going on. Okay. So I just, sorry, I'm having a little trouble advancing this thing. It's taking a minute. There we go. So I just described kind of these big picture differences about the kinds of management portfolios that are generated by these different ways of thinking about food and agriculture. And a second idea or concept coming out that I found particularly useful, developed in social ecological resilience thinking, is this idea that there are different adaptive strategies. So there are different ways that we can think about adapting. And those three ways are very simply protect, adapt, and transform. That's one way you can describe the difference among these different strategies. Protect strategies will target specific threats, and they're designed to protect the existing system. And unfortunately, I think a lot of what we do more generally in community-based adaptation and adaptation planning is think about how to protect what we have. And I can ask me a question about why I think that's unfortunate. I'd be happy to go into that. The adapt group of strategies seeks to enhance functional and response diversity. So simply put, the adapt strategies are looking at the elements of a system and how they're related and the relationships there, and they're attempting to change those relationships in order to increase response capacity. And I talked about that a little bit earlier already. And that final set of strategies involves that transformation capacity. So it's actually their practices or approaches that help that system be transformed into a new identity that is more resilient. So overall, the difference between protect, adapt, and transform is that there's an increasing change to agroecosystem structure, function, and purpose. And so for right now, I'm happy to come back to this, and if you're interested and get into more detailed discussion, but I want to leave this idea here right now with this thought, that notice that this adaptive strategy is deeply rooted in how ecosystems work. And then we can apply this strategy to farms by thinking about farms and food systems as agro ecosystems. So there's really a lot packed in to this particular graphic, and be happy to come back to it. And it's got a lot to do with what we already know about what it takes to have a functioning, healthy ecosystem. This is yet another idea that is I found so fascinating when I first ran into it. And I have come to understand that it is actually incredibly valuable when you're thinking about farm and food system resilience. And it's incredibly valuable, particularly because what this graphic shows is that you can have too much diversity. It turns out that as you, this graphic is showing resilience on the x-axis increasing, and then diversity or connectivity is another way. Connectivity is describing the relationships between all the different elements in the system. But diversity and connectivity is increasing on the, I'm sorry, I think I said that backwards. The resilience is increasing on the y-axis and diversity and connectivity is increasing on the x-axis. But don't get too hung up about that. What I really want you to get from looking at this image or this graphic is that there is this sweet spot in diversity, let's call it. There is this sweet spot that gives you the optimum resilience. And as you move away from that, if diversity decreases, So we're coming down onto the left-hand side of this graph. If diversity decreases, you get more fragility. The system becomes more fragile. It's more prone to breaking. Now, let's go back up to that sort of sweet spot, that window of vitality. It turns out that if diversity increases past that window of vitality, you also are pushing the system towards fragility, towards more easily broken, because there's too little efficiency. I find this idea fascinating. And after I learned it and began to apply it to my work, I have had many occasions to challenge the thinking about how more diversity is better. Diversity is always better, and more of it is always better. I run into that idea a lot working in ecological farming communities. And yet, at the same time, there's not a lot of research in farming systems to support this, but there is some to suggest that, for example, there's a sweet spot of numbers of species for CSA producers to produce. And above that, you actually get a reduction in success of CSAs. And then obviously there's some point below that sweet spot number. There's been a little bit of research done on this. It fascinates me. And it's basically saying between 20 and 30 species are about right for a CSA operation. And I find that interesting because many CSAs start with maybe 50 or 60, and the ones that hang on, usually that are successful, I shouldn't say that hang on, but that are still growing 10 years later, very often have cut down that number of species. So anyway, not a lot of research here, but it's given me a lot of food for thought in understanding that there is this sweet spot of diversity, and that we probably ought to be aiming for that, not only in our farming systems, but also in our food systems.
Laura,
Yeah.
Michelle asked, there's two questions, but Michelle asked, can you clarify, do you mean diversity of farming practices? I'm sorry, diversity of farming systems or practices within a single farm, or both?
Yeah, so in my specific example with CSAs, that was numbers of different species grown. So what is the species mix grown on a farm? But I hadn't thought about this so much in terms of kind of going to that next level of thinking about farming system types. I think that's maybe where you were headed with your question. And I think that's maybe true too. I don't know, I have to think about that. That challenges my own thinking that, we basically need ecological farming systems and food systems, really. But I imagine that this idea works for if you're thinking about a food system and thinking about the production side of a food system, having diversity in how that food's being produced is probably a good idea. Anyway, great question. Thank you for that one. You have got me. I'll be thinking on that one for a while and how I might be able to use it. And that's one reason I really enjoy doing these book talks, because I just really appreciate the questions that come up.
Laura, there's one other, which is from Kevin. What about the idea of community food waste diversion projects serving as a source of compost for local farmers?
What about that idea? That sounds more like a comment than a question related to this. I mean, my reaction to that comment is, sure, we can divert food waste, but it's very clear to me that what we need to do is stop wasting food. Diversion is too far down the food system pipeline to be a real solution. But why don't you hold that thought and we can have a conversation. I've just got a few more slides to show, and then we'll open it up and we can have a conversation about composting food waste if you would like a longer conversation. Okay, Liz, okay for me to move on?
Yeah, please do.
Okay, great. So I in the resilience section of the book with this discussion of these rules of resilience. I know there's a lot going on in this picture. I'm not going to go into it all. Happy to come back to it, let you really take a look at it. But I was able to distill down these many and complex ideas about resilience done into what has been working for me as kind of 3 rules of resilience. And for me, it works as sort of a design and management checklist. And if you look at the superpower figures there in the right in the middle of this, that's what I want to just refer to for right now. And those 3 rules are equitable relationships. So a resilient system will cultivate equitable relationship. It will cultivate regional self-reliance and also community wealth. And when I use wealth in this context, I'm really meaning there's a much older word that my ancestors used called the commonweal. And out of that language came the idea of a commonwealth. And it's really community wealth in this context is speaking to a wealth of all the resources communities need for their health and well-being, to sustain health and well-being over the long term. And, and in this part of the book, I end the resilience discussion by pointing out that these rules of resilience are actually directly conflict with business as usual in our culture and our economy. So there's really a lot to dig into with these ideas around resilience. And then just to finish up, the last part of the book, or the third part of the book, digs into what this means for food systems more generally. And this graphic just gives you a sense of the complexity or the potential that we can, of using social ecological resilience thinking in thinking or rethinking our foodways. And I also raised the question in this part of the book, is what we're trying to do, or is what we want a resilient foodway as contrasted to resilient food systems? And there's a lot to unpack here. We can come back to it again, but what I want you to take away from this quick look at this graphic is just that we actually know a lot about what it takes to create resilient food systems. And we can apply those ideas in our food system work or in our foodways work. I also take a look, for me it was a surprising look at the geography of the US food supply and the implications of the concentration of production in this country in a few regions. So you can see from this map kind of what these regions are contributing to our domestic food supply. And in particular, I think part of this work, it really opened my eyes to just how fragile the domestic food system is, because so much of our production is focused in the Southwest, and that's where a lot of the most intense climate change impacts are already happening and projected to get worse. And then finally, there's a solution that seems to be emerging across different communities of practice in thinking about this question of what will the future of food look like? What does a resilient food system look like? And within my own use of that word resilient, I'm packing in also equitable or just food system. And this is one idea that captured my imagination. And that's the idea that we're actually going to reorient the national and global food systems. Will reorient the US food system to feeding major metropolitan areas, and also um, oh, sorry, I'm losing the word there. Yes, thank you. Re-diversify food systems, um, so that we're creating these incredibly diverse food systems, within major metropolitan areas, and then in the rural outskirts of these areas that are focused on feeding their core the people in the core metropolitan area. And with this idea too, there's still a place for doing some production in areas that are particularly well suited, some food production, particularly of large foods that need large scale production, like grains, continuing to grow some of those foods in places that are well suited to them, and moving some of that production nationally through this diversified system of regional food systems. And there's also still a good resilience argument for continuing some global imports or some trade, and also trade between these different major metropolitan areas. So again, there's a lot behind this particular graphic as well. And then I finished the book. The last part of the book is farmer stories. I'm not going to share any of those today, but I finished the book with this list of 12 things that you can do to cultivate a resilient agriculture. And I think what I'd like to do right here is stop the sharing and let's get at some questions. And then I'll come back in a little bit and share those 12 things as a way to sort of finish up today, if that works for folks. So this is where you all got to be involved in this conversation. So
Yeah, thanks, Laura. Thank you so much. I would invite folks, if you'd like to come off onto screen. I understand if you need to hop off. You will also get a recording of this, but we have about half an hour more for conversation with Laura. Laura, I'm just going to start off until someone else has a question, and that's sometimes, especially when I see that map of the regional food sheds, I feel like sometimes either we're accused, like we in food system, people who are trying to change the food system, of trying to like go backwards in time to a time when all communities could sort of feed themselves. And I think the criticism is like, oh, that's so inefficient, and why would you want to do that? When we think that's a sign of strength and resilience. So can you just like talk a little bit about that tension of, sort of the Luddite argument or whatever, or trying to go back in time?
Yeah, I hear that. I hear that a lot too. Two things come to mind immediately whenever I'm asked that question. And one is, we've never had a food system like this. So this is not going back to some earlier time. These ideas about the food system, and to be really clear, this is not my idea. This is an idea that I am seeing popping up in food system work, being done in parallel in many different communities. And in communities, I mean communities of practice or communities of research. And in my own work, I have always been intrigued when I see the same idea bubbling up in different places. And that's always gotten my attention, because it seems to me, if, for example, that particular map was developed by a group of researchers at Columbia University, they were all designers. I don't know quite how to, it was a community of practice of folks that know how to use design thinking. So no one in that group had food system background. They were handed this problem to solve using design thinking, and the solution was that map that I just showed. And the problem they were asked to solve was, how do we increase the dietary health of Americans? That was the problem they were asked to solve. And that was the map that came out of a long design thinking process, which just really intrigues me. And there's a lot more to that. And if you get the book, or I mean, I really don't like to flog the book at these kinds of things, even though I know I'm supposed to. But send me an email if you don't know, or actually no, the last chapter, the food system chapter in the book, was excerpt by resilience.org. And so you can go and read about that map, read all the research associated with this idea that we need to reorient food systems to around major metropolitan areas and diversify. I don't know why I'm having trouble with that word today. I use it all the time. But anyway, rediversify food production. And you can go to resilience.org. Maybe if you can find that, Liz, maybe that's what you're getting ready to do, and put that link in, that'd be awesome. And you can go read about that, and all the references are included in that resilience.org excerpt. So you can go read about it and see what you think with some more depth. So let's see, Kevin, looks like it's saying so much relationship with soil health and public health. Absolutely. In fact, I addressed that in part in the food system chapter. I'm pretty sure that's where it is. Because for me, I got really fascinated as I was writing the second edition at the many changes that had occurred in food system thinking just in the 10 years from when I started that first edition and the second edition. And in particular, one of the big changes I think that is going to have a lot of influence on where we go in the future with food systems. We got somebody unmuted. If you can please mute, that would be awesome. One big change in thinking that emerged since I began writing the first edition is this idea of One Health. And I'm responding to that question in or the comment in the chat. There's so much connection between public health and soil health. And yeah, it's right there. It's right there. So for me, these are really inspiring times. I really see so much new thinking emerging around these issues. And I feel really grateful that I've been in this game long enough to see this change happening in the discussion. Let's see, Ted says, I'm curious with all the change required. Uh-oh, let me grab it back again. I'm curious with all the change required, what's the best place to start? You know, that's a perfect question for my ending. So I will, I'll make sure we'll get to that in about 10 minutes. And then we can, one of the things I did with that last list was I tried to think about from the littlest steps to the most intense steps that people could take. And I wanted to encourage folks just to start somewhere, you know, do something. So I'll get back to that, Ted, if that's okay with you. Thanks for that question. And if somehow I forget, I don't think I will, but if I do, please just speak up when we get there again, okay? Thanks. How do we get people not familiar, engage with pushing for change? Yeah, that's kind of, maybe this is the time to go look at that list. Because I think the best way that I know in my, this is now more just my own experience. The best way that I know to get people interested in change in the food system is to start by getting them interested in their food. And that is actually a pretty heavy lift in our culture. So that's the very first thing, is just to even get them thinking about what they eat, and the fact that it's always there, if it is for them, and that they don't really have to think very much about it. Let's see. I kind of feel like, Liz, stop me if I'm wrong, but we're a small enough group. People could unmute to ask a question. Is that okay with you? Okay,
Absolutely.
so I just would invite you, but I'll go ahead and read Sandra's while you're thinking of your question and getting ready to unmute. There's a huge economic piece to these topics. Yes. Government programs, how do we address the economic piece? That's a great question. And the way we address the economic piece, my fast answer to that is the way we address the economic piece of this change is the way we address economic pieces of any change that has broad public benefit. And so I don't understand why very often people say we can't afford to feed our people better. I just, that feels very shallow and unthinking response, because in fact, we are such a wealthy country, and we have a long track record of success when we choose to invest in changes that have broad public benefit. So we could go into detail, but in order to do that, Sandra, I'll get you to unmute and give me something specific, because that's such a big, you're exactly right. Economics are a big piece of this, and we're going to have to make some change. One thing I think about, particularly this push towards regenerative agriculture and food systems, and one thing I appreciate about the regenerative agriculture movement is that it has engaged private investment in new and innovative ways. And so I think that is absolutely part of the package of solutions that we will need to untangle this economic piece, which, as Sandra says, is huge. Okay, so please feel free. Liz, I'm going to ask you to monitor chat, but I really would appreciate hearing from some of you directly if you're willing.
Laura, I'm the one who asked that last question. So I just want to clarify, I'm not a farmer. I'm an eater, as I guess you guys term me, but I'm also extremely interested in regenerative agriculture and completely agree with those wonderful slides of yours that I saw just a few moments ago. I feel that we really need organizations like the Illinois Stewardship Alliance so that we can fight for this better economic piece that we need in order for farmers to do what I think many of them want to do. I just feel like, I guess I'm thinking a little bit about South Africa. They had a revolution, and suddenly they had African Americans who were in control of the political dynamics of their country, but they were locked out of the economic piece. And so they struggled and struggled and struggled for decades in order to make change. I just want the small farmers and the regenerative farmers to be at the table when resources are apportioned for farmers. And I'm sometimes feeling that they're not there, that they're not given their fair share. So that's what I was trying to get in my way.
That's great, and thank you for adding a little bit to that comment. And I think you're exactly right, but I would include all the stakeholders in the food system, all along the food system, including food system workers, for example. It's not just farmers. I think to achieve a just transition, we must bring along the entire food system, all the people and the eaters, as I think of folks that have no other connection with the food system beside eating. You're important too. And yes, we need to find solutions that include all the stakeholders. And even if you're focused, if an organization or a program is focused on just one part of the food system, make sure it is inclusive. And that is another concern of mine with the regenerative movement, which is that it very often, or at least in my experience, it is primarily, particularly the regenerative ag, particularly the new interest and incredible shift in resources towards regenerative ag. Or now I think a newer term for that might be climate smart agriculture. I'm concerned that this massive shift of resources is moving towards the largest and conventional commodity growers and leaving out small and mid-scale diversified farmers that are doing a lot of the feeding of people rather than the production of commodities. And that's something, Glenwood is a partner in one of the Climate Smart Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities projects. And our role in that project is to look at ways to be sure how climate smart practices can be implemented by small and mid-scale diversified farmers. Which ones really work for that kind of a farmer? And also we will be piloting a peer-to-peer technical advice and verification program as well through our particular project, so that we can also begin to address the high overhead expenses associated with, for example, participating in a carbon market. So I know I'm getting kind of into the weeds there with that particular comment, but it all relates to what Sandra is saying about making sure that we have inclusive engagement with this change, with this transition that we're trying to make.
Hi, my name is Beatrice, and I am a farmer in Chicago. In Beecher, Illinois. I just started farming in 5 acres this year, and I will agree with most of the points that have been put out. And I think it's, like you said, very important for resources to be directed to small scale farmers, because I would say that for me in particular, I have these 6 acres, but I still have to maintain my full-time job to be able to start building infrastructure, to be able to build, to start growing food. So yeah, so resource management and diversification is important too. And also for my case, growing up in Africa, it was like farming was associated with failure. Like if you don't do well in school, you will be back in the village. So, just opening that, trying to educate the masses about the importance of growing food in their own backyard or in their containers or in their apartment, that is also very important if we want nutrient-dense food to reach all the populations. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment, Beatrice, and good luck. Good luck to you starting up that new farm. And yes, I agree with everything that you said. And a little earlier, someone asked a question, so how do you get people who aren't interested in food interested? I have found in my own life, because I've been a gardener my whole life, and I also farmed diversified vegetables for about 5 years. But one of the ways that I've seen, and I've also taught community-based food and farming classes and gardening classes for a long, long time as well. And I think one of the best ways to get eaters to appreciate what farmers are doing is have them grow a little something in their yard. I think it's always a pleasure to me to be a part of helping some new neighbor or something go ahead and get a little bit, put some vegetable plants in their ornamental beds, and then listen as they say, oh my gosh, the bugs, or oh my gosh, the this or that. And also, you know, not just those kinds of challenges, but their appreciation for that food when they finally eat it. So I think that's a great way, as Beatrice said, to just start getting people involved. So I think this is probably a good time, because we're running out of time, for me to go back, and I'll just show that last list, because we've had several questions now about how do we, what do we do? Like, what's the first step to this transition? So I'm going to share that, and then I think will still be a few minutes that we can discuss some of these if you're interested. Okay. So this kind of wraps up the first 3 parts of the book into 12 things you can do. I didn't originally have this kind of list in the first edition, and then after spending 3 or 4 years speaking and talking about it, I got this question so much that I did include it in the second edition. So I appreciated all those questions that inspired me to do this. There's one other thought I had about this. Oh, and then I haven't talked at all about the 4th part of the book, but I think that's really the heart of the book, because those are the new farmer and rancher stories that I included in the second edition. And so you can learn more about all those farmer and rancher stories at that website, realworldresilience.com. But anyway, here's a list of 12 things that you can do to cultivate a resilient agriculture. The first is to stop wasting food. And so this really speaks to that earlier question or comment that composting was the way to go. And what I want to invite you all to think about is that the act of wasting food, actually, yes, you can compost it, but if you were to instead stop wasting it, that would send a ripple back through the food system, and eventually you would be able to reduce all of the inputs and all of what's involved in creating that food in the first place. And I can say well, the other thing to say, the reason this showed up on the list first is, although it seems like a relatively easy thing to do, I can tell you from personal experience, it can be difficult. But the other reason it showed up first is there's a lot of strong evidence that this is one of the top 5 climate change solutions. It's one of the most cost-effective ways for an eater to begin to be part of a climate change solution. The second is to stop buying silver bullet brands. And so really what I'm getting to here, to really understand the richness of that particular thing, you'd have to have read that food system chapter. But basically there I argue that, simply buying the regenerative Twinkies is probably not enough, and that there is no silver bullet in the food system for fighting climate change. And rather than one silver bullet, there's going to be, if you take the analogy or metaphor, if you're willing to go there with me, is silver buckshot. There's going to be a lot of individual solutions. I don't mean individuals will put them into place, but different kinds, a diversity of solutions throughout the food system that I think will be needed to get us where we want to go. So stop buying silver bullet brands. Stop thinking about resilience as only bouncing back. Remember, there are those 2 other parts of resilience which actually are the most valuable. Cultivating response capacity, so there's no damage, so you don't need to think about bouncing back, and then that bouncing forward or transformation capacity. Stop believing that somebody else will save us or that nobody can save us. So these are 2 sides of the same coin. Basically, optimists believe that somebody else will save us, i.e., I don't need to act. And pessimists believe that nobody can save us, i.e., I don't need to act. So both optimists and pessimists are two different sides of that coin of not acting. And so I'm asking you to stop that kind of behavior and get started doing something. The fifth is to learn a new resilient food waste skill. And so we talked a lot, several questions related to this idea of just getting more involved in your food, learning something about it, and how important that is, particularly for bringing people into the work of changing the food system. Number 6 is learn how your ancestors nourished their community. So this is an invitation to begin learning about traditional ecological knowledge, and also learning about what solutions lie in indigenous wisdom. Number 7, learn about the land, people, and communities that feed you. And so that's an invitation to look out at the communities, at the land and the people and the communities that feed you, in that stream of food, that food shed that you create with every choice that you make about what you eat. Number 8 is learn more about climate risk, resilience planning, and climate justice in the place you call home. And what I have learned, speaking all over the country, is that very often the general public, they really don't know what's happening in their own communities around these questions of risk, resilience, and climate justice. And when you take a moment to look into it, it's really inspiring to find out already the kind of work that's going on in your area, and so that you can immediately plug into if you decide you'd like to do that. Number 9, follow the 3 rules of resilience at home, in your profession, and in your community. So remember, those 3 rules of resilience are to cultivate mutually equitable relationships, to cultivate regional self-reliance, and community wealth. So if you were to start using those 3 rules just as a checklist as you make decisions through your day, through the month, through the year, both at home, in your profession, and your community, you can begin just by doing that to begin moving your community toward a more resilient place. Number 10 is participate in your regional food shed. So that's now asking you to begin to invest in a regional food shed. 11 is participate in just transformation. Now you're asking, I'm inviting you to get even more deeply involved in social transformation, social justice. And the last one is to remember that privilege is power and use yours for the good.
Oh, I'd like to add something if I can, please, especially for points 11, 12.
Okay.
And, I'm inviting everyone to get in touch with the Stewardship Alliance, the Illinois Stewardship Alliance. It is there for our protection, our assistance, and everything. And currently, to be able to address points 11 and 12, they're suggesting that a House bill has just begun to start. It is House Bill 3627. You can send an email, a text, or a phone call to your local senator and ask them to support the installation of this bill, which will allow for Illinois to be able to have a soil health week every March, every first week in March. So therefore, it kind of focuses on the regenerative practices. And also I like to add to Sandra's point, because if we are doing local systems, like in your backyard, And then utilizing, if one person is growing one thing, one person is growing something else, community-wise, you could even have a little block market, especially in those areas where there are food deserts. You can actually start a market. You have got economic situations going on because you can sell those, or you can swap and trade. With our communities within Illinois being as diverse as they are, I've got United Nations lives on my block. And
That's
I've got
great.
everybody growing something, and we do a little food trade back and forth, but it actually gives a chance for you to be able to have that level of diversity. So I'm saying, get your senators involved, because that's money. They will basically help you to be able to work on composting, work on seed saving, work on diversity in terms of it. So therefore, we don't have to depend on, most of our food don't come from Illinois. Most of our food that comes from halfway across more than 250 miles away. So therefore, we can bring back within ourselves and use our farmers, because we have a lot of farmland in Illinois that is underdeserved. So I'm going to
That's
stop.
great.
I'm going to
Oh,
stop preaching now.
okay, thank you, Carmen, but you gave us some great ideas for how to get started. So I really appreciate that. And but I do want to remind people, it's not just about the farmers, it's all through the food system. And to just think about where you intersect with food system. Maybe it's in your job, or maybe you work for a distributor, for example, or something like that. And so we all touch the food system, probably in more than one ways, many of us. And so there are many ways to get involved. And then you have those 12 steps as well. So any last thought? Or maybe this is just a great time to say thank you. Really appreciate the conversation. And thanks again, Liz, for inviting me to join. And
Laura, thank you so much.
mm-hmm.
And I launched a poll to evaluate this session. So most of you have responded, but it looks like a few more just need to respond to that poll. We really appreciate it. Laura, I know you can't see the results yet, but almost everyone learned something new, and this was very valuable to them. So thank you very much. Carmen did a great pitch for the Stewardship Alliance. Consider becoming a member if you're not. If you already are, thank you. We are building a powerful statewide alliance so we can make that just transition to regenerative food and farming. And check out in the link the rest of the events for Soil Health Week. Today is just the kickoff. So thank you, Laura, and thank you, everyone. We'll also send out a recording of this, so we really appreciate it.
Thank you. Great to meet everyone.
Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Laura, that was so great. I don't know if you'll even be able to. I'm going to stop the recording.